Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Daily Devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. It is so good to see you all today. I hope you're all doing well. Today, this Friday, we're going to continue through our Revive School reading plan. And yesterday, we just wrapped up the poetic book of Lamentations. And that means today, we're going to be doing a brief introduction, a look into the major prophetic book of Ezekiel. So today, following the reading plan, we'll be focusing on Ezekiel chapters 1 and 2, two very interesting chapters, but then also trying to get a feel for what kind of a book Ezekiel is like, a glimpse into the background of what you might see in a book like Ezekiel, so that we can sort of get our bearings on the book itself and hearing its message clearly in the way that that we're hearing the word of God through Ezekiel to the people of Israel in exile, and indeed to the rest of the nations, and also catching this vision of how God intends to renew and make whole his promises and his people upholding those promises. And so today, if you like, feel free to go ahead and pause, read through Ezekiel chapters 1 and 2, then make those few observations about the whole book. So clearly, I think I need some more coffee, so go ahead. Okay, so let's talk about some helpful things to remember about the book of Ezekiel. One of the things that you'll come to notice is that true to most of the prophets, there's going to be these wide and expansive themes that we've certainly dealt with before. Themes of judgment, themes of sovereignty, God's sovereignty over the nations, and also themes of hope and restoration. All of those spread wide and unpacked, dramatized, and writ large across the book of Ezekiel. And one of the things that's important to notice about, that's different about Ezekiel compared to, say, Jeremiah or Isaiah, is that Ezekiel is actually writing from in the midst of exile. So, whereas Isaiah was in Jerusalem by now, close to 100 years, 150 years or so previous, where Isaiah endures the siege of the Assyrians in Jerusalem and God rescuing them, but then prophesying that Judah and Jerusalem are going to fall to the hands of Babylonians, that he experiences that. But then when Babylon comes and conquers Judea and takes exiles, takes King Jehoiakim with him to exile into Babylon, and Jeremiah, even though he experiences that, he's still left behind with the remnant of the people of God in Judah and Jerusalem. But here with Ezekiel, Ezekiel is among the number of people, the desirables, almost you might say, and taken by the king of Babylon and brought into exile into the land of Babylon. So from where Ezekiel is writing this, he's writing as a foreigner lost in exile, and who, like all of the prophets, is wanting to, or rather is called upon by God to be God's mouthpiece to a people who are lost in exile. And this is not a pleasant calling. In fact, it's a very difficult calling that Ezekiel has to face. And as we'll notice in chapter 2, as you've probably noticed if you've read chapter 2 already, that God's calling on Ezekiel is a very difficult one, in that it is by the work of God, the hand of God upon Ezekiel, that is strengthening him, hardening him, that's making him, it's toughening him up in preparation for the difficult task that God is calling him to. That's a worthy point of making. Uh, Again, as we've noticed and seen many times over throughout the Bible, that uh, God does not call the equipped, but he equips the called. He doesn't give us tasks that are equal to our strength, but rather gives us strength equal to the tasks that he calls us to. About Ezekiel in general, I'll be honest, it is probably one of the prophetic books that I personally have some of the most difficulty interpreting, because Ezekiel, of all the prophets, is, in my estimation, among the most bizarre, and whose writings are populated and filled with lots and lots of visions of the heavenly throne room, God in his dwelling place, that really do, when the way in which it's described, just defies visual categories. I have extreme problems with, I mean, I have a lot of extreme problems, you probably know that, but extreme difficulty with trying to visualize and picture the visions that Ezekiel is making. And another difficulty that I have with, or that a lot of us have with reading something like Ezekiel, is that also so much of his language, it has what you might call a shock value. Let me try and use an example. Growing up, one of my favorite musicians, artists that I've enjoyed and still enjoy to this day is Alice Cooper, who has been long regarded as the godfather of shock rock, where when you go to an Alice Cooper concert, you know that there are rock and rollers who do sometimes some crazy things on the stage and smash their guitars, light them on fire, Jimi Hendrix style, that sort of thing. But with Alice Cooper, you get much more than that. Indeed, you actually get not just rock and roll, but rock and roll through drama. And a lot of images and demonstrations that really do sort of arrest your attention to a point where you're almost sort of clutching your seat and saying, whoa. So that when you see an Alice Cooper concert and see the spectacle that he puts on stage, it arrests your attention in ways that, and in degrees that you're not accustomed to. Ezekiel, in that respect, is something of God's shock rocker. The person who is not afraid to use disturbing images in order to be able to get people's attention. Shocking, provoking images that are designed to shake the people of God out of their complacency and awaken them to the realities of their condition, what they've been doing, what their idolatry has done to them, and that the shock isn't just for shock value's sake, but basically to arouse them from their slumber and their complacency and their belief that all of what they're experiencing in exile is just a matter of fate, that they didn't actually do anything that would have brought this judgment upon themselves. And so, Ezekiel is the type of book that really goes there to try and get the audience's attention to recognize what kind of moral cesspool that they're wallowing in. Another thing that's important to remember, or at least one of the key themes that you'll see sort of stretched throughout, or maybe not stretched, but sprinkled throughout, is this image, this disturbing image of God leaving the temple. And one of the things that's these images about God and his glory leaving the temple is important in at least two respects. The first one being is that it's important to remember that when God makes his dwelling among his people, that he dwells among them in a tabernacle. In other words, a very, very, very nice tent. It's very nice to be sure, but it is a tent nonetheless. And like with all tents are not made for permanent residence. The tent is the sort of thing, the temporary shelter where you're here at this one place and then you move and then you go to this place and that place. You are nomadic in that sense, so that when God is dwelling in a tent, it bespeaks to his movement throughout all of creation. Something happens when God is dwelling in a tent, and then when the people of Israel transition into the period of the monarchy, and then David wants to build an actual temple for God, and then Solomon goes so far as to build a temple with bricks and mortar for God. Before long, the people of God get accustomed to thinking that the living God somehow has a permanent address here on earth. And that because he has this permanent address, in some measure or another, that this God can be contained and can be domesticated. So that when you see these images of wheels that are filled throughout the Ezekiel, wheels within wheels that are filled with the Spirit, and the Spirit moves the wheels and going these places, going this place, that, and the other. It's like God is wanting to demonstrate to the people that the Spirit of the Lord is moving out. Just in the same way as the Spirit of the Lord could come in and inhabit this temple, the Spirit of the Lord is moving out, and he's not going to be contained there. Which is a disturbing thing, because when you see that, it's hard not to feel in some measure or another that God is abandoning his temple, and that because he's abandoning his temple, he's abandoning his people. And that's not a fun place to be, but it's important nonetheless, because it breaks down the hollow and empty hope that the people of God are affixing onto the temple itself, so that as long as God is in the temple, then that's the sort of thing that's giving us hope. So these type of images break down that false hope that they're having. But then also to remember that if indeed that the Spirit of the Lord is moving and is going places, it awakens in their hearts, it should awaken in the heart of the listeners, this desire or this attention that it is important, the most necessary thing is not containing God in a sanctuary, but to be like Ezekiel, that is filled with the Holy Spirit and go where God is going. How God is accomplishing his purposes is not a matter of domesticating God, but rather allowing the Spirit of God to fill us and to be led where he's going to do the sort of things that he's called us to do. Hence, one of the reasons why in a book like Ezekiel, you'll also see an increased language about the Spirit, the Spirit, the Spirit. Ezekiel uses that language a lot, as also does the prophet Joel, if I'm not mistaken. So that's another important thing to remember. But then also, lastly, with Ezekiel, one of the common refrains, in other words, a statement or a phrase that you're going to hear over and over and over again. And if it's repeated for emphasis. And if it's there for emphasis, it's something that we need to pay attention to. And he'll use it anywhere, I think, counts vary from between 62 to 90 different times throughout the entire book. And it's this phrase, "Then you will know that I am the Lord. Then you will know that I am the Lord." So that by what God is doing through all of this, is to bring people back to a knowledge of who God actually is. So that for as difficult and disturbing and problematic and heart-wrenching as the message of Ezekiel is, and difficult to deliver, all of this is to try and bring these people who are in exile back to a real knowledge of the living God. Because with that knowledge of the real God, there's the foundation that, and indeed a real hope that they can become the people of God once again. Yes, this is God's hand in the difficult, almost hopeless feelings of living life in exile, that even in exile, that God is not done with them yet. But let's continue. Here's one I want us to read and make just a few different observations. I'd like to begin reading in chapter 1, verse 25, and continue through the end of chapter 2, because chapter 2, as we know, is a pretty short chapter. I think we can handle that. So let's read together. This is chapter 1, beginning in verse 25. It says this: "Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above the throne was a figure like that of a man. So I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. So was the radiance around him." In other words, he's catching something of what it is that he's describing as what he thinks is a vision of God, a theophany. At the end of verse 28, it says this: "This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord." What he's seeing and is describing is like afterglow of the trailing of what's left behind of the glory of God himself. "And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking." It's first important to remember that what it is that he's experiencing does not appear to be a direct vision from God, otherwise that would consume him, but that he humbles himself, falling face down, totally prostrate at what is a trail of the afterglow of what is the appearance of the glory of the Lord. This diffused presence of God. And even in light of that diffused presence, he melts and prostrates himself. This is very similar to what Isaiah experiences when he falls prostrate in the presence of God. It's easy to look at some of these things and to take them as direct representations of an image of God. And even from what we know, from what Ezekiel describes, these are not direct pictures, as it were, but rather his best attempt at describing the awe and his being overwhelmed by what is merely, if you can say merely the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So I think that's worth remembering as we're looking at all of these bizarre visions of what Ezekiel is describing. And he says, let's press on into chapter 2. He said to me, "Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you." As he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and heard him speaking to me. So in the same way that The Spirit inhabits the wheels, as it was just described, these wheels of the cherubim, this living chariot that God rides in his sovereign dominion over all creation, that the Spirit of the Lord is inhabiting him. In other words, he is becoming a part and being moved and becoming sort of God's instrument, his vessel, in accomplishing his purposes throughout creation. At least one thing that is certainly key here is to remember that what is being described here is a foreshadowing of what the prophet Joel prophesies, and indeed what comes later at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 about what God would prophesy when he pours out his Spirit upon all flesh. That this would be the time or the place or the instance, the means when God would inhabit his people. And by inhabiting his people, that his reign would be made manifest upon earth through his people. And that what you see happening in the life of Ezekiel, what it is that he's experiencing, is not just the hand of God upon him, but his presence inside of him. That this is what God does as he intends to accomplish his purposes, as indeed he's intending to accomplish his purposes through Ezekiel. And so let's read about his purposes for Ezekiel. It says, he said, "Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have been in revolt against me to this very day. The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, and whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them." So that much will be undeniable to them, to know that God actually has sent a prophet to them. Some may listen, some may not, but nobody will be able to deny that Ezekiel wasn't a prophet. And to know that for all of the things that a rebellious house of Israel can say, the one thing that they cannot say is that nobody told them. And that the people of Israel will have to be accountable before God. That their blood will be on their own heads because of what Ezekiel did. But let's keep going. "And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions." In other words, by being a prophet under these people, he is going to be met with hostility and enmity on every side. That all you get from them, in the same way as when you pick up a scorpion, the only thing you get is stung. When you pick up briars, the only thing you get is a thorn. That all you're going to get from these people is hostility and enmity, persecution, suffering, etc., etc. This is the reality that Ezekiel has to face. What an exciting calling that he has. "Do not be afraid of what they say or terrified by them, though they are a rebellious house. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. But you, son of man, listen to what I say to you. Do not rebel like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you." And of course, this eating what I give you is going to become in a symbolic fashion about the scroll that God calls Ezekiel to eat. And it's a way of speaking about how the words of God are actually going inside Ezekiel. As we say, you get out what it is that you put in. If it's if it's garbage in, garbage out, if the words of God are going in, the words of God are coming out. But what I find also interesting, and we'll close with this, Ezekiel, even as a prophet in exile, among the exiles, among this rebellious and hostile house, even for him, there is a temptation to fall into the same traps and patterns of sin and rebellion as they have. And as is so often the times when God calls us and calls us to a difficult task, an uncomfortable task, a painful task, it does mean that God calls us to be different. And not just different in any kind of respect, but different because we're a people who are energized, made alive by the power of the Spirit, and whose life, whose patterns, whose vision, whose words, whose attitudes are made alive by the Spirit inside and is breaking with the worldly patterns that are so oftentimes at odds with the purposes of God. And God takes individuals like you, like me, like us, and says, by what I am doing in you and through you, you are going to be different. And I will preserve your life and sustain you. Whatever you do, don't fall into the same trap of rebelling against God in the same way that the world around you has rebelled against God. And all of us, that's a temptation that we have to face. And it's my prayer for you and for all of us that we would take God's words to Ezekiel to heart, that we would not be afraid to be a people who live by the Spirit of God, who are wholly committed to God's call upon our lives, to be the sort of people that he fashions us to be. And so, thank you so much for your patience in listening through a book like Ezekiel. If you haven't, do please subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you get daily notifications to follow along with the reading plan here. And I'm looking forward to seeing you when we get to meet here, be it Sundays, Wednesdays, and as we continue to live and grow in growing mature disciples of Jesus Christ. And so, God bless you, take care, and I will see you all next time.